All right, we're live. We're live. It's Wednesday, everybody. And I have one of my favorite people of all time, Dr. Sharina Rice, here to hang with me. Sharina, how are you doing today?
Amused, amazed, a little crazed, but I think that that's still the way that it is in the startup world in general.
I think that's a pretty darn good way to live your life. So I think that's pretty exciting. Um, awesome. Well, I'm happy to hear that. And I feel like every time I talk to you, in some way, shape, or form, like you're always in a great mood. You're always having something exciting going on. So last time we spoke, I know that there were some pretty exciting things going on in your life. And so I think it'd be kind of cool to maybe start off just telling people about a little something that you had developed that might have made its way out into space if you're willing to share that.
Oh, sure. I've been working with the Hollow Arts. It's called Hollow Arts Collective on LinkedIn, but it is this international project where there are global artists who produced art and advisors. And this has really grown to be this amazing thing that Miriam Bryan put together. So then yes, she has floated around and talked with a whole lot of people. And with that, we got to send our art on a NASA SpaceX cargo mission over to the International Space Station. And it's never been done in this kind of way before. Perhaps it's never been done before, but it is an honor to have some of my works of art sent into space. And I've created some pieces of art. Let's see. Here's one of them. And this kind of shows the style where there's this smoothness of a black on white. This one I think is, well, I created this kind of almost as if it's the essence of neuroplasticity because, well, there's this sense of there's not really a beginning or an end, but it's all a progression. And I think that, yeah, neuroplasticity is a very cool, very cool property because you can't really do anything to the brain without changing it.
It's a fair point. Well, I think what's interesting about your photo as well, if you want to just put that back up really quickly too, is the circular component of it is almost like obviously a never ending aspect, which is why circles are really important symbolically. But it also looks too like you at the top of that have like a presynaptic vesicle, and those look like little neurotransmitters going into like the synaptic cleft, right? So there's probably far more to meets the eye. And for those of you who I just lost on that, I apologize. But Trina, thank you for sharing that with us. That's exciting. Of course, Shrina, we were talking, 2 weeks ago or last week, and just casually drops and was like, "Hey, I got art sent to space," and I was like, "What? How does this happen?" But of course, you did. So, always entertaining and exciting to be able to connect with you. And this is actually something that you and I have been talking about for a bit now. Is that we get to selfishly have these discussions with each other relatively frequently, and it's safe to say that you and I, feel like we get to be the cool nerds in the room, right? To have conversations, be passionate about a subject, and then really bring that to the forefront for us. And for you, in your career right now with the company you're working with, and also the work that you're doing with us at the studio, we get to use our brains to literally help other people change their brains and hopefully for better, right? And so, as we started talking about this, Shrina had the brilliant idea of pick our brains about brains, which is obviously the title we're using today, and it's spot on. But I think one of the fun things that we're excited about too is that we are really passionate about education, and we're passionate about educating as many people as we can about the brain and their brain and how to make it better and how to improve it. And whether it's from the clinical side of things, like what I've spent the last decade in, where I'm working with patients and trying to figure out how to improve symptoms, or if it's the interesting aspects of like neuroscience and the brain and what Shreen has done with her research and what she's bringing to the forefront with the companies and the startups that she's working with. We kind of get to span all of this. And so Shrina, I think I learned so much from you, and I think it's just really fun for us to be able to have these discussions, and now we get to have them in front of everybody else. I think my first question for you is, I get people who ask me a lot about the brain and questions I've never ever fielded before, but I'm curious to hear from you about what is something that you think like many people don't actually know about the brain, or what is like a specific concept that not many people really understand about the brain that you think could really help them in understanding their brain and how it functions and how it works?
I think one of the things is that there aren't just neurons in there. There are also glia cells. And at that, with neurons, there aren't just one kind of neuron. So, for instance, usually people talk about, oh, I want to increase my brain activity, let's say. But there is this question of, well, what kind of brain activity were you increasing? Are you just working on making yourself worry a whole bunch more and faster so that you can get some higher powers of, let's say, theta waves? Because that could be an indication. So I think that, well, for one thing, we can think about excitation and inhibition as two big classes of neurons. There are excitatory neurons and there are inhibitory neurons, and both are needed in order to keep neural circuits in balance. But then there comes this question also of how many kinds of neurons are in the brain. And that will completely depend on which neuroscientist you ask. They may try to classify by morphology or the shapes of neurons. They may try to classify by the kinds of neurotransmitters the neurons may release. They may classify by what the neurons particularly code for. So, for example, there are particular neurons that will code for and be specific for which direction that my head is facing. So these are head direction cells. And a set of head direction cells is going to be particularly excited when I'm facing here versus if I'm facing here versus if I'm facing here, and so on. And so and so the brain is really cool, partly because it's able to perform lots and lots of functions. But of course, there is so much nuance that goes on there that allows so many functions to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point as well too about how well executed and engineered our brains really are, right? I mean, there's so much that we're still figuring out about the brain, about what it does, about the capacity that it inherently has, as we develop and grow and change throughout life. But, this whole conversation and discussion about what our brains do, there are some theories, and I don't know whether they've been confirmed or denied yet, but I listened to this amazing TED Talk years ago talking about how originally what brains were designed to do, and the reason that we actually have a brain is to really promote movement and to navigate our world. And while we have all these other amazing things about thinking and emotions and being able to process information and talk and all of that stuff, there's I think it's a sea sponge. There's a primitive organism that has a primitive nervous system that floats around in the ocean. And when it's in its younger years of life, it has a nervous system to float around and move. But the moment that it actually finds a permanent location to attach itself to a rock, one of the first things that it does is it actually breaks down and digests its nervous system. And so some of the earlier thoughts about that were actually that your nervous system was there designed to help you navigate your world. And this is where things get interesting, not only from a clinical side of things, but also from a research side of things. Is what you just encoded is like our orientation in space. This kind of term we use to say, proprioception or like sensory-motor integration. Those are big fancy terms to say, where are you in space? And so I think we sometimes take that for granted about what our brains really do. We think about a good brain having like a high IQ and being able to communicate effectively, but the brain of a professional athlete is in some way, shape, or form quite different, but also quite varied and highly skilled for the activities that they're doing. So I'm curious, when you were going and getting your PhD and going through grad school, and even to where you're at right now, where now you're writing and you're speaking and you're being asked to come do some cool speeches. Like, what was something that you were really intrigued by when you got into neuroscience that you didn't fully understand getting into the field that you're like, oh, this is something that really motivates me to continue to learn?
I think that it's being very easily amused by everyday things. And so things like walking around and things like sleeping, well, these are things that a lot of us take for granted just as
Mm-hmm.
part of everyday life. But in a way, given that everyone does them, I thought that they were even more intriguing than, say, studying a particular disease state when I was in grad school.
Mm-hmm.
And so I studied how brains how brains process when they are moving through spaces, but not just moving through spaces. Imagine this kind of scenario. There's a mouse on a ball, on a swivel, on a cart. That was one of the setups that I used in grad school, because there is this question of what do we lose when we switch from active means of motion, like walking around or riding a bicycle, which really do take our conscious attention to move through, to more passive means of motion. So, for example, I get in a bus and I'm driven around, or in a train and I just am driven in a passive way. I don't have to pay any attention to my surroundings. I'll just get to from point A to point B regardless. There is going to be a difference. That was my hypothesis, and we tested this partly by having these mice on a ball, on a swivel, on a cart. And so one thing that we found is that if the mouse was just standing on the ball and being pushed around, then its theta rhythms and gamma rhythms would not be as high as if the mouse was actively running at the same speed as it was formerly passively pushed. So if the mouse ran faster, for instance, then its gamma rhythms would increase. And we think that has a lot to do with sensory integration in this navigational process.
It's interesting. Yeah, I think I think you hit the nail on the head with the fact that there are a lot of things that people do take for granted until they lose them, or until they have something it becomes an issue. I know for me clinically, I've spent the last decade working with trauma, and really trauma from a physical standpoint. Obviously, there's going to be emotional and mental aspects, but like a concussion or an auto accident or a brain injury. And so, what happens in those situations is that things that we do take for granted, right? Things like digestion, things like simple balance mechanisms, being able to read, have a conversation with somebody and look them in the eyes. These really basic mechanisms become quite difficult for patients. And the hope is that after a traumatic event, your brain heals, and majority of people's do, quote unquote speaking. But for those that don't, I really saw this clinically, and it's interesting, how when patients, they would come into the office, and I was never the first doctor to see them, which was always difficult. But as they would come in, they would say, "Listen, like, I used to be able to go and drive in my car, and now I get dizzy. But nothing's changed with my car, my driving, right? It's my brain that's changed." Well, of course it is. They'll say things like, "Oh, I used to be able to go shopping in a grocery store, and now that's really difficult, and it makes me get disoriented and lightheaded." It's interesting how the environment doesn't change, but the brain's perceptions of it does. And we've all done those little brain teasers where you can do the 3D eye, and you can pull an image out, or there's even some tests that can be done where you can find like a physiologic blind spot in your vision, because we have them, but the brain's really good at compensating and creating this amazing panoramic view that we all take for granted. And so, Shrina, I'm curious, this is a kind of a nerdy question for me to ask, but is there like a favorite area of the brain that you find really intriguing, like a section of the brain or like a region of neurons that you're like, oh, this is really, really interesting?
I'll go with the retrosplenial cortex, because that's what I studied in grad school. And I think that part of the reason why we looked there was that it was an intriguing area that a lot of different pathways seemed to lead to. So, for example, it had a lot of reciprocal connections, so back and forth connections with the visual cortex, with the somatosensory cortex, with various other regions like the thalamus as well, that were involved in, well, it seemed integration of spaces. And this is a part of the brain where if it has a hemorrhage, then a person, they can't draw a map of the city that they've lived in their whole life and have accurate places in it.
Yeah.
And so that is pretty great. There are some parts of the brain that are studied a lot more than others, just because they had been studied a lot more. And so this looking into something that was a little bit more unknown, where retrosplenial cortex, even a lot of neuroscientists, they've never heard of it, even though it is quite a large stretch of especially a rodent cortex, but it's found in a preserved or a way that shows up across phylogenetics.
Can you, for those who don't know where that is, can you talk to them about like what it does and why it's important for us? You alluded to a little bit about, you know, spatial awareness and involvement with the visual cortex. Can you just tell people just maybe on a granular level of kind of what it does and where it's located?
Yeah, the retrosplenial cortex, it's called the retrosplenial cortex because it's behind the splenium. And so it is there as a thing that tells us where we are in space. It tells us where the landmarks are in our environment are in space, and it integrates those two things together so that we know where we are in relation to other things are in our environment.
Cool. Awesome. That's interesting. And I know the research that you did was quite high level as well, too. I know that there were some things that you actually discovered with specific types of waves that would be put together, and we'll allude to that as well. I think one of my favorite areas of the brain is the hippocampus. I can get specific. We'll say the dentate gyrus if we want to get really nerdy on that. And for those of you who don't know what the hippocampus is, your hippocampus is kind of like this really interesting area that integrates with spatial awareness. There's components with that. It also integrates with memory. And there's emotional aspects that are related with it too. And without going into too much detail, your hippocampus is essentially like this like short-term file cabinet throughout the day that stores different experiences that you have, and we call them, you know, short-term memories. And then what's really cool at night is when you sleep and you go through different types of REM and non-REM sleep cycles, your hippocampus and the activity in your brain, actually the blood flow in your brain actually like vastly increases in the frequency and the velocity of blood moving through. And even the lymphatic system, the glymphatic system of the brain, which is essentially your immune system, it speeds up. And what happens during these sleep cycles is that these memories are kind of like your brain goes through and like looks through the file cabinet and says, is this memory relevant for today? Yes, so we're going to store it into the prefrontal cortex or, you know, parts of the temporal lobe. If it's not, we're going to get rid of it. And what's interesting, and you know, our mutual connection, Dr. Gina Poe, has done an amazing research into this space. So what's cool about that is that we know that these areas are really active, but they're also implicated with things like Alzheimer's and dementia. And so what's interesting for me about that, though, is that this is one of two areas of the brain, of the adult brain, where neurogenesis can still occur. And all that that means is it's a fancy term saying here's where you can create new neurons throughout the rest of your life. Babies have that capacity to change and have neurons that are created for up through, you know, early years of life. Shereen and I no longer have as much of a capacity to do that, although our brains can still change. And so the hippocampus is intriguing to me. I think there are a lot of people trying to crack the code there. But I think one thing you brought up that's relevant is that there are a lot of areas that communicate into that area, and there are a lot of areas that are responsible for input from that area. And so I'm interested to hear, like, I'm sure you've gotten asked a ton of questions about neuroscience and the brain and what you do. Like, what is one of the most interesting questions you've been asked, or what is one of the most interesting comments somebody has made about the brain that maybe was right or maybe was wrong or maybe even made you like laugh a bit?
Well, one thing is this sense that the brain is a surprise minimizer that I think is very commonly talked about, but I don't believe it. And the reason why I don't believe it is because some people really like being surprised.
Fair.
And if people were always trying to minimize surprises, how would they ever learn anything? How would they
Mhm.
actually navigate through their lives? How would they be able to get along with other people who may do stuff that they can't predict, that person cannot predict? So
Fair.
then I think that yes, it is more that the nervous system is a navigator through life rather than some sort of surprise minimizer. Though we do try to minimize surprises in some senses. In terms of if I'm walking around, then I know that it's good for me to be able to predict what the next step is and to not, let's say, stumble because I assumed a different terrain than had been in the path. But I think that this matter of, okay, how do we navigate through stuff that used to be important? What isn't How are we going to take that and navigate things that are important in the future? And what do we do if we've never seen that situation that is going to come up in the future?
Yeah. Yeah, good points. Yeah. I always am intrigued by some of the sayings that people say in neuroscience, right? And that, I guess maybe a better way to put it is things that are neuroscience based, but they're actually not actually based in neuroscience. And so I think the one that always gets me is that when people come to me and they say, well, do we actually only use 10% of our brains? And I think it's a genuine interest, right? And intuitively, people don't know. We can't logically think your way through that. Now you and I know we use all of our brain, right? We use every single neuron that we can. Otherwise, we're too efficient to not want to do that. But the history about this, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, is actually comes from the way that they used to stain cells. So what they had found when they were staining cells is that the cell bodies would stain very differently than the axons and the neuron aspects and the dendrites. And so what they found was when they would stain the spinal cord or even the cortex, 10% of the brain had different aspects like the cell bodies. And then the rest of it was actually the dendrites and the axons and whatnot. And so they would stain it. They say, yeah, 10% of this is actually where the cell body lives. But the other 90%, is absolutely 100% needed. And so for those out there who are questioning and wondering, we do use 100% of our brains. Although I'm sure there's some people we could maybe argue only use 10%. So I always get intrigued and get a kick out of that one because, to be fair, I've had a lot of people ask me that because there is a bit of confusion on that. So one thing I think that's interesting that people have talked about, and you kind of alluded to earlier as well, is that there are a lot of things that we don't really have to think about that our brains and bodies sort out. And I'm curious for you to kind of give an overview or an explanation as to why would the brain do that? Why would the brain have so much efficiency to allow us to, I'm not sitting here thinking about balancing my blood sugar or regulating my heart rate. If there's an area of the brain that will do that for me right now while we're talking. I'm curious to get your intake and input on that and maybe give a quick explanation as to why the brain would do that.
Well, I have 3 comments about 3 things that you've said prior to this.
Take away.
So for instance, the brain does have silent synapses to it in terms of those are not really transmitting electrical activity. They exist as silent synapses, but that is partly because, well, if another synapse, let's say, dies off, then it's really nice for the brain to be able to reconstruct the pathway in a different way. And this is a wonderful property, partly because, okay, let's say that you happen to lose your synapse for something, or you happen to need to grow a new one really quickly. The nice thing is that the architecture is there for that to happen without wasting energy. And neurons, they are very biologically expensive to maintain. So it needs to be an efficient system in that sense. But also it needs to have that matter of modularity. The other thing is that I can't at all take credit for discovering the new brainwave that my lab in grad school had discovered and characterized. I think that Megha Ghosh and Fangqi Yang really did a ton of work on that. I did a lot of mouse experiments for that, but the level of analysis absolutely was not my own work. And so that's how neuroscientists work, which is that we work together and we often need to combine multiple techniques at once in order to get to the heart or the brain of the problem.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. That's very noble of you. And obviously, I'm sure they would say the same thing about the efforts that you put in. And so, we're kind of winding down on our time, Sharina, and I wanted to see if there's anything that you wanted to leave our listeners or viewers with, whether they're listening live or they're listening later at the recording at some later date. Is there one thing you think people should take away? Is there one topic? Is there one overall kind of message that you would like to send somebody home with today?
Yeah, I would say, well, the next time that you are taking a walk, actually be present and get a sense of what is really going on around you rather than just, let's say, losing your mind into a screen, because it's going to have a different effect than if you were really paying attention.
It's a great message. Yeah, I think we can all do a far better job of staying present. And with that being said, I think the message I want to leave people with today is that, you know, every single day you have an opportunity to change your brain. That doesn't always mean for better. It doesn't always mean for worse. It depends on what you do. And so I think what's amazing and what I've seen and experienced, you know, personally and even professionally, and whether it's with patients or just even with building companies and meeting people, is that when you can change your brain, you can change your life. I think the most amazing part about being a human is the fact that we have the opportunity to continue to learn and grow and become more knowledgeable in a field or acquire a skill or whatever it is. And the reason we can do that is because of the power of the brain and this whole concept of neuroplasticity that, you know, Sharina started this amazing presentation with today. So don't underestimate that. The brain is a powerful thing, and at one point, you know, this is the only organ that actually got to name itself at some point in history. So, pretty powerful. So, Sharina, as always, I want to thank you. I always enjoy having conversations with you, and now we kind of get to do it on a public format. So, I appreciate you taking the time to chat today. And I know it's, you know, later time in London for me, and it's early for you over in California. But I wanted to thank you and appreciate you taking the time to chat with everybody today.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Bye, everybody. Let us know if you have any other questions, and Sharina and I will follow up, and hopefully we'll do another one of these and have a little bit of a blast on it. So, thank you.